My name is Chris White. I teach at Vassar College in New York. I teach a lot. I teach and write on science, spirituality, and pop culture in the modern U.S. So my most recent book was called Other Worlds. It looked at kind of the history of the idea that the universe has invisible spaces or layers or dimensions, and then the ways that those ideas go from the history of math and physics into pop culture and are borrowed by people in pop culture. I think a lot about the cultures of people that we might call spiritual or spiritual but not religious. So I'm gonna kick off the panel with I don't know, maybe 10 to 15 minutes of remarks about science and the impossible, and then I think we'll just go down the row here. The panelists will say a few words about their questions and issues and their ways of thinking through science and the impossible, and then maybe we'll just have a conversation among the panel, and then we'll open it up. I'm sure there's a lot of folks here who have things to say about this really rich topic. Okay, so let me start with a couple of comments. Like I said, I do a lot of work thinking about the recent history of science in pop culture and thinking about supernatural, paranormal, and spirituality. I recently showed my students in an intro class on science and religion a wonderful conversation between Richard Dawkins and Brian Greene. I'm sure many of you have heard those names before, but if you want to Google it and watch it on YouTube, you can do that. I think the title on YouTube is called An Appetite for Wonder. So it's a wonderful hour-long conversation between Richard Dawkins, who, if you don't know, is, I don't know, maybe the most well-known evolutionary biologist in the world, also a very well-known atheist and spokesperson for that view. Having a conversation on a stage in New York. There's thousands of people. It's a big auditorium, not sure where it is. I wish that many people came out to hear me talk about my books, but that doesn't usually happen. One day. Yeah, so they have a fascinating conversation. And I just want to talk about one or two takeaways from that conversation. At about the 30-minute mark, Brian Greene turns to Richard Dawkins and says, you know, I know that you've talked about this a lot, but I want to talk about God and the supernatural. And there's kind of like nervous titters of laughter, you know, in the audience. And I didn't say who Brian Greene was, but I guess I was assuming folks know Brian Greene. He's a physicist at Columbia University. And it turns out he has a slightly different take on some of these questions about how to think about science and non-science and science and the impossible. So Greene found it necessary here in the presence of Dawkins to say repeatedly that he was not a believer, that he was an atheist. It's interesting, though, a couple times when he says that, you know, I'm not an atheist, I don't see any evidence for the existence of, you know, supernatural things. It's interesting that several times he does this. He says, I'm sorry, you know. He says it, and then he kind of apologizes to some non-existent supernatural being. And he says a few other things that are interesting and that end up antagonizing Dawkins, which is where the conversation becomes really interesting. He says again I'm an atheist, but I really have no problem with a really smart physicist-type God. And maybe there's this type of physicist God who's behind everything. And Dawkins is provoked, you know, and he says that this is really regressive, you know, sort of wishful thinking, and it's really destructive of the foundations of science. You know, for you or anyone else to insert, you know, any kind of intelligent supernatural force is really cuts right at the foundation of science. and it cultivates bad intellectual habits. So I think there's three or four interesting things that I want to remark about in this conversation, and as a way of setting up a panel about impossible things and how they fit or they don't fit in science. First of all, I think it's interesting the ways that scientists police the boundaries of science in ways that always seem to exclude the impossible or the metaphysical. You know, the key move, and this has been the case since the 19th century, the key move in making a science is to exclude the non-physical. I have a wonderful senior at Vassar College who's writing a senior thesis about the history of biology and the ways that biologists talk about science. And lo and behold, all of the biologists who are spokespeople for science from the 19th century to Richard Dawkins, what do they talk about when they want to talk about what science is? It's not metaphysics, it's not religion. It's all about those things that we need to exclude. So I want to make that point, that I think the scientific, in a way, comes into being through these forms of exclusion. We know that scientists excluded these things because they believed that religious truths just hadn't led to progress in knowledge, and that religions, in fact, had often obscured attempts to know the natural world. I think there's some truth in that. And I, for one, am grateful for the rise of modern science in the last century and a half. I'm also sympathetic to many scientists, past and present, who say things like science and reason are the ways to counter things like religious fanaticism and destabilizing forms of intolerance and hate, and substitute in their place more reasoned forms of conversation. I also believe there's a difference between reliable forms of knowledge, reliable scientific knowledge, and the knowledge promoted by other kinds of folks like anti-vaxxers, climate change deniers, flat earthers, QAnon, Pizzagate, and so on. And so I don't think, or actually want to say, that Western science is just one system of knowledge among many others. I actually want to discriminate between knowledge that is wrong and unreliable, like Pizzagate and QAnon, and knowledge that is more correct and more reliable. So one question I have, and maybe this is a question for the panel, a question for the audience, is how do I get what I want? Which is an expanded notion of science, that accommodates impossible things, while still preserving science's careful, discriminating empirical methods and its skeptical approach to knowledge claims. I quote, believe in science when it comes to making judgments about climate change and vaccines, for instance, but I don't believe in science when it comes to science's dismissive attitudes towards UFOs or the paranormal. Am I pro-science or anti-science? How should I think about this? And how do you think about this? That's a real question. Okay, so I think that the Dawkins-Greene conversation points in different directions, maybe towards what I'm calling an expanded definition of science, ways that we can think of an expanding science to accommodate more things that we want to talk about here in this group. So let me talk about a couple of ways I think the conversation leads us in that direction. First of all, I think that the Dawkins-Greene conversation is a good reminder that science, as we know it, was generated in particular contexts for particular reasons, and that it therefore can be altered and reformed in different ways. It was generated, as I said, certainly as an effort to minimize the cultural power of religion and disperse its threatening non-physical agents. We know that those people who built, funded, and professionalized the sciences also excluded the impossible as a protective strategy against forces that they felt they were susceptible to. One scientist was raised by Pentecostal parents but failed to have a dramatic conversion experience. Another scientist was plagued by constant fears of going to hell. A third scientist lived in a British colony and relied on scientific forms of knowledge and practice, taxonomies, assumptions, technologies that controlled colonial subjects, for example, phrenology and things like that. The sciences they shaped were protective strategies against the irrational, the anomalous, the things that challenged them, the things that didn't fit, things that made them feel vulnerable, things that could violate and terrorize them. You see this, I think, in biographies of scientists, then and now. You see this in the Dawkins-Greene conversation here as well, the history of sciences as a history of the repressed impossible. It's interesting, too, that Dawkins was actually born and raised in Nairobi during British colonial rule. And I think there's a way in which, when you watch that video, you see the kind of outrage. You see the outrage that Dawkins has for any kind of speculation that Greene is sort of engaging in a sort of playful way even, but there's a kind of an outrage about opening the door in that way. Okay, so a second issue the Dawkins-Greene conversation raises, I think, is whether imagining impossible realities destroys scientific habits of mind, and this is something Dawkins says very clearly, and other people, many other people in the history of science say, or on the other hand, that imagining impossible realities leads to an expanded set of questions into reality, as Greene seems to indicate, as romantics over the history of romanticism have indicated, as Jeff writes about, right, as a number of us here write about, as sci-fi enthusiasts write about, as Afrofuturists write about, and many others actually involved today in sort of a renaissance of studies of the power of the imagination. There's a lot of people writing about this now, actually, the imagination as social, imagination as a powerful thing that's not just psychological, but is enacted socially. Greene, for his part during this conversation says, yes, well, I don't believe in an afterlife, but I do find myself talking to my dead dad. Another interesting comment he makes, which I think gets to something interesting about the lived aspect of scientific life, right? And the exclusions that become intolerable for certain reasons. But so he says, yes, I don't believe in an afterlife, but I do find myself walking in the streets of New York talking to my dead dad. And Greene is sort of has a playful way of talking about that, and he's willing to accept it as a part of life. And Dawkins again says, really kind of harshly, I think, at this moment in the conversation, well, this is kind of a primitive vestige of magical thinking that's coming out in your psychology. It's a regressive habit of mind. But again, I think, this is Dawkins being triggered, right? In any case, I think there's something hopeful here in the fact that Greene, who's the younger scientist, right, is able to recognize that impossible kinds of experience or even metaphysical commitment might not destroy scientific thinking, but may rather open up reality in new ways. I think it was Jacques yesterday who was pointing us in the same direction. Imagine things, dream, right? There's a kind of a power in that. I mentioned that Greene is younger than Dawkins. It reminds us too that sometimes sciences change when the older generation dies off, right? A point that Max Planck makes and Thomas Kuhn makes as well, that science advances at funerals. So maybe all you younger people in the audience, it's up to you. Okay, so, and I think there's also plenty of evidence this kind of imaginative, speculative thinking does move the needle, whether it's in sci-fi or it's in visionary fiction. These kinds of texts outside of science do shape science. I write about this in my book, Other Worlds, which I already mentioned, which is sort of about how many scientists bump up against these impossible concepts, like non-locality, like higher dimensional spaces. And they find themselves saying things about imperceptible things. They find themselves saying things about non-physical things. They find themselves transgressing these kind of boundaries that they've wanted to police as they shape their science. And I know Eric and Mike too want to talk about some impossible concepts like time, right? And are leveraging impossible concepts like time, reverse causation, time travel to think in new ways about what science is and what's possible. Two other excellent books, maybe some of you know these books, that I think are really good in helping us think about how impossible speculation and imagination does reshape science, is David Kaiser's, How the Hippies Saved Physics, which is a very cool book where he kind of looks at basically a group of marginalized physicists, unemployed physicists, right, who speculate, who get together, and whose ideas do come to seed different kind of technological and mainstream developments in physics. And I think there's a number of books like that. There's another very interesting book called Naming Infinity by Lauren Graham. I don't know if you know that book, but a bit different, but also a book about the ways that religious imagination in this case and religious practices stimulate new discoveries in mathematics, in set theory and concepts of infinity. The book's called Naming Infinity. So, okay, back to a few more comments about the Dawkins and Greene conversation. So, I think it also reminds us that the exclusions of science were not just the impossible things, not just the supernatural things. They were also the folk, the female, the ethnic, the non-white, the indigenous. these things were repressed along with other threatening forms of agency. Right? And there's many people who talk about this today. One of them is Sandra Harding. I'm sure some of you know her work. She makes this kind of critique in her book, Is Science Multicultural?, pointing out that while white Western scientists created what they thought of as universal scientific ways of thinking, they actually were producing a local knowledge system linked to Western Christian categories, cultures, and power. In the Dawkins-Greene conversation, we have two white male scientists who, as scientists and spokespeople for science, implicitly and explicitly promote a worldview that foregrounds control, rationality, technoscientific mastery, again, for certain reasons. These methods and these practices can be challenged. And all kinds of assumptions at the heart of Western science can also be challenged. The uniformity of nature, some folks in this room are doing that. The universality of Western science and causality. Right? I know some of my fellow panelists are interested in rethinking some of those issues. Would it be possible to move away from knowledge production focused on control and domination and move towards knowledge that accepts ambiguity, that accepts being plotted into someone else's story, that accepts loss of control, maybe even personal transformation, maybe even partnership with human and non-human others? Okay, and then one final comment about the Dawkins-Greene conversation, and I'll turn it over to Eric. I think the conversation reminds us that paradigm shifts in science are sourced in wider cultural trends. And I think it's also kind of a hopeful thing to think about. A number of scholars in STS and sociology of scientific knowledge have talked about this, how culture and science co-produce one another, right? Which foregrounds, I think, as we think about changing science, it foregrounds events like this. It foregrounds other events in culture. Maybe it foregrounds the scholarship that some of us do, and certainly also the really amazing range of visionary fiction and speculative work that we see in our new televisual culture, right, of the supernatural, of ghost hunting, and all these kinds of things. So I think you do see this kind of change at the level of culture, and I think it will leak into scientific communities. Last night, our panel went out and talked about some of these possibilities for changing science, and I mentioned Ron Westrum. Maybe some of you have heard Ron Westrum, a American sociologist, who's examined how is it that impossible topics do get integrated over time into scientific thinking. And he basically says that, the first stage is sort of people have experiences, and they're kind of scattered experiences. The second stage is those experiences get talked about in pop culture a lot more. And then last but not least, right, scientists turn to these questions because after all, they're part of pop culture too. And they begin incorporating them into more expanded notions of science, more expanded frameworks, discourses, and methods. So we can hope anyway. Okay, so those are some of my initial thoughts thinking about science and the impossible. And Eric, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
So I'm Eric Wargo. I'm by day I'm a science writer in Washington D.C., but on the side I'm a writer about I'm a pseudoscience writer is the way I like to joke. I am the author of 2 books on precognition. Time Loops is my first one, and Precognitive Dream Work and the Long Self is my second book. And it's a long story how I gravitated to this topic about a decade ago, but I'm incredibly fascinated by time, obviously, and causation. What particularly interests me is not simply the reality of precognition, which I think pretty much a lot of people in this room probably are totally down with, but the implications of that for culture, for one thing. If precognition is real, then there are a lot of things that follow from that, and not only culturally but also in terms of reality. You have. If precognition is real, if time travel is real, then you have causal loops are a part of our reality, and that sort of the conundrums and problems raised by causal circularity are kind of what I focus on. So, and one of the things I love about the topic is that it straddles that boundary between science, which addresses causes and is very good at addressing things like causation and even potentially retrocausation. There's a big conference in Bonn, Germany coming up in May that's all about retrocausation and superdeterminism, which is the new sort of catchphrase for that. So this idea is making headway in mainstream science. But precognition, it also straddles that scientific causal domain and the world of meaning. I mean, precognition operates on meaning. We're meaning motivated creatures, and we precognize events that are meaningful to us. And you can't study the topic without looking at both of these things, and they don't mesh well. The science does not deal well with meaning, but the humanities do. So it's one of those truly interdisciplinary subjects. And obviously, I mean, we're hearing that that's the same is true of UFOs as well, obviously. So yeah, I mean, I won't say much more right now, but I will sort of highlight a few of the things that Chris mentioned. This idea of exclusion. Science is has always been founded on exclusion. I would raise the question. I don't necessarily have an answer to it, but as a circa 1980 post-structuralist trapped in amber, I would raise the question whether you could ever get away from that exclusion, that the boundaries may shift, the things that are excluded may shift, but I feel like somehow science is always going to be constituted on an exclusion of something, that's integral in a way. So something we could talk about or not. And I would also highlight what you mentioned, the Ron Westrom stuff about experiences leading to expanded notion of science. And this is where my focus really has been, especially in my precognitive dream work book. I feel like, if we're gonna move the topic of ESP and precognition specifically forward, it's not going to happen the same way it's happened with UFOs. It's not going to be the Pentagon doing revealing its work and on the cover of the New York Times. I think it's going to happen more in a grassroots way, because everybody experiences precognition. They just don't know it. And if you can sort of awaken people to their daily, nightly precognitive experiences and their dreams and so on, you can sort of change. I would like to help change the conversation that way. And sooner or later, you're going to get someone in a psych department with funding and access to the resources to do some big studies that are what's needed to sort of legitimize it scientifically. So I feel like that exact path via personal experience is probably the way to go. But I'll pass it on to Erin.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So my name is Erin Prophet. I'm a lecturer at the University of Florida. I received my PhD here at Rice in 2018. Jeff Kripal was my advisor. And what I studied actually is 19th century responses to Darwin. And many of you are familiar with the history of the Society for Psychical Research, Frederick Myers, the development of the concept of the imaginal and the super in that time. But I also focus on spiritualism and its influence on Alfred Russel Wallace, and specifically the idea that in the wake of natural selection, and also one might say in the wake of Friedrich Schelling's dynamic evolution, a new imaginal of human possibility begins to open up. And Jeff has referred to these systems as evolutionary esotericisms. I've started calling them evolutionary theologies because I think, well, why not just seed that? Okay, they're speculative. But in any case, because they took place both inside and outside of religion. Spiritualism is often looked at as a sort of a fad or a trend that sort of took people over in the 19th century. But in fact, as we know, many elite thinkers and scientists were a part of both spiritualism as well as the psychical research that went on at that time. So I've been spending some time, as we all have been, looking at the wonderful, beautiful image that's been prepared for our conference, and looking at how it also seems to embody some of the tensions and contradictions that come about in these systems, and also even in the work of Charles Darwin. We think about it and sort of we have the human eye replaced by an owl's eye, right? And so suggesting that humans may have some sort of talents that they can recover from our animal past, our connection with animal life. And then there's also the starscape, the galaxies, which symbolizes sort of futures, right? And so just to bring up a little bit of fun to this, how many people in this room can wiggle their ears? I mean, so don't feel obligated to raise your hand. But okay, so a number of people can wiggle their ears. So Darwin actually wrote about this, and he suggested that people who could wiggle their ears were taking advantage of a rudimentary or vestigial talent that was left over, right, from our mammalian past when directional hearing was more important. But he also speculated that folks could, through practice, and he actually had someone in mind, could learn that everyone could sort of learn how to wiggle their ears. So in a sense, to recover these lost talents. So Jeff has started calling them, both and I during our work, vestigial and potential talents. So some people believe that evolutionary futures are going to allow us to develop, and that the psychic powers, or perhaps the bellwether, or the forerunner, people who can display these, are forerunners of the rest of humanity in some way. And certainly that's how many of these systems, these optimistic, self-empowering systems, developed. And so when I look at the potential tensions, I ask, in what direction is this evolution supposed to be going? Is it going sort of, we often use our connection with non-human animals to project ourselves in the future as analogically, but people often also imagine that we're going to recover, and even Myers talked about perhaps recovering the dreamlike state that earlier asexual organisms possessed, in which they were sort of awake and asleep at the same time, all the time, instead of having the same sleep cycles that we have. So these are some of the things that I explore in my dissertation and in my forthcoming book, Evolution and Psychic Powers, which looks at sort of some of the metaphorical clashes that happen when you put these ideas in concert. So in addition to my religious studies, I also have a master's in public health and epidemiology, and I'm interested in the ways in which human beings, in which spiritual practices impact our overall health. So in the sense that Darwin thought that spirituality and religion were adaptive, which often gets left behind in some of the neo-Darwinian approaches, Darwin actually wrote fairly positively about religion and other cultural productions. And so we know that today many people are turning towards, and many folks, such as people who subscribe to the idea of collective evolution, right, are proposing that people should engage in the technologies of the self, as Foucault named them, in meditation, in spiritual practice, etc. And we also know that there's a growing body of research that suggests these practices are also salutogenic. So my current work, and I actually teach a course called Spirituality and Healthcare, and I work with pre-health students who are sort of interested in what are the implications of all of these spiritual and religious practices that people engage in. And so what I'm interested in is what's also been called the biopsychosocial. And certainly when we look at the vast number of people in this country who have some connection with spirituality and spiritual but not religious, we can see that this is also potentially going to have an impact on people's health. And so that's, I think, an important area of research. Medicine is one of the sciences that, in general, can't quite afford to ignore the paranormal or the super or the miraculous in the same way that other sciences do, because doctors are often faced with patients who recover inexplicably or patients who practice bizarre types of spiritual activities that seem to have some influence on their health. So obviously many doctors, and one of the borders that I look at that gets policed is obviously the concern that people will engage in alternative practices to the exclusion of proven medical assistance and other types of modern medicine and the wonders of Western biomedicine. So as I look at this sort of space between medicine and religion, I look at ways in which humans have been inspired to both personal improvement and collective action. And as I, again, try to parse out the contradictions in some of these systems, what I also can't fail to notice is that many of these systems, while they say they're about collective improvement, are often about individual improvement, individual evolution and transformation beyond death, which is actually quite different from biological evolution, which requires sexual reproduction and requires a body. So that's sort of the scope of my work, and I'm delighted to be on this panel, looking forward to a wonderful discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. Mike Masters. I'm a professor of biological anthropology at Montana Tech in Butte, Montana. My primary area of research is in hominin craniofacial anatomy. I mostly look at the long-term craniofacial changes throughout the 6 to 8 million year history of our particular lineage. There's also a biomedical focus where the two main trends are an increase in cranial capacity, but also a forward migration of the brain out over the eyes. And in fact, we're the only mammal that has that craniofacial configuration where the brain sits directly above our eyes. The other main trend is a reduction and a retraction in our facial anatomy. So I look at the eyes and the other ocular tissues in the context of vision in a functional sense, whether or not juvenile onset myopia, astigmatism could be related to those general changes in our cranium throughout that time period. Back in 2012, I began writing a book about whether these same changes, if they continued into the future, could help explain the physiological form of these commonly reported beings that are seen in association with UFOs, if they could be our future human descendants. I timed it so that I had full professor status and I had the safety of tenure because things weren't great back then. It's gotten a lot better, and obviously Leslie Kane and others, Ralph Blumenthal and numerous others have contributed to that, which I'm very thankful for. It's taken some pressure off. So I published the book in 2019, and I'm working on a new one that focuses more on these different contact modalities, the close encounters, abductions, and looking for patterns in the context of this, what I call an extratempestrial model, but also in the context of ultradimensional, interdimensional, the simulation hypothesis, obviously extraterrestrials. And doing this in the context of impossible science, I mean, we have something that's strictly forbidden in paleoanthropology is talking about the future of human evolution. And I avoided in this first book speculating about what might happen between now and then to cause us to have bigger eyes and bigger heads and smaller faces and more advanced technologies and all these things that are fun to think about, but we just can't know. It's teleological, and it's been beat into my head throughout undergraduate and graduate school that we just don't talk about these things. You add to that backward time travel that some very loud critics argue is impossible, and also UFOs, which is not something we're supposed to be talking about either, especially in the context of these other taboo topics. So it was sort of an effort to add another viewpoint. The idea, it occurred to me when I was 8 years old, but the idea's been around since the 1940s is the earliest I've been able to locate. And it's obviously not the only explanation. I don't put it forth as something that explains all of this, but I think it should be considered in the context of of everything else that's also been put forth as a theory to explain this phenomenon. And with something this complex and mysterious, we should be considering all valid hypotheses. And I feel that this is one that could potentially help explain a lot of what we see in the skies and in these instances of close encounters. But yeah, that's Cliff Notes' version of where I'm coming from. So, Stan.
Okay. So I'm Stanislav Panin, and I'm a PhD candidate here at Rice University. My research deals with the history of science, technology, ideology, and paranormal in the Soviet Union. And with that in mind, the question I'm probably the most interested in is how the notions of science are different, not just historically, but also geographically. I mean, if we look at the Cold War era, for example, we'll see that there is a substantial difference between how science was understood in the United States versus how it was understood in the Soviet Union. Things that were considered perfectly scientific, in fact, the standard of science in the Soviet Union, like the Marxism, for example, would not necessarily be considered scientific outside of the Eastern Bloc countries. Like, for instance, Karl Popper would say that Marxism is not really a science. It was, but now it isn't. So that brings us to an interesting question. If we define the impossible through the limits of science, and science itself is different, again, not just historically, because it would be all too trivial to say that science was different some 5 centuries ago, but also at the same time, if we just move from one country to another, one culture to another, our notion of science can be dramatically different. And with that, our understanding of what's possible and what's impossible will also be very, very different. But there is more than that to it, I believe, because then it brings us to a question of, can we really study within certain cultural contexts things that we deem impossible within these cultural contexts? Can we even notice, can we even perceive these aspects of reality that are impossible within our cultural system? To clarify this with an example, my go-to example would be a psychological experiment that was performed at Harvard University known as the invisible gorilla experiment. So the invisible gorilla is one of my favorite psychological experiments. It's an experiment about perception and attention. It's an experiment where a researcher asks you to look at several people who just throw a ball to each other, and you have to count how many times they did that. That's just a study of how attentive you are, how well you can count the times that they threw the ball. But what happens in the middle of this video of these people throwing a ball is a gorilla that walks from one end of the video to the other end of the video. And apparently 50% of people watching this video do not notice the gorilla on this video at all. So that brings us to a question, how that happens. I mean, it's a full-sized gorilla, but like 50% of people just didn't see it. Well, that's because we don't really or don't necessarily see things that we don't expect to see in a certain time and a certain place. If we think that there shouldn't be a gorilla in this experiment, then we will not see a gorilla even if it walks, before our own eyes. In fact, there is a modification of this experiment that was performed with radiologists. And psychologists who conducted the experiment asked radiologists to look at just your normal X-ray scan and to explain what they see on this scan. And the problem is that on this scan, except for your normal bones and stuff, there was also a gorilla, an X-ray gorilla. And apparently 83% of radiologists didn't notice the gorilla on an X-ray scan. Why? Well, obviously because if you are a radiologist, you don't expect to see a gorilla in someone's chest. That's how it is. So the way that we already have these expectations define even what we can and what we cannot see. Even our experience is not really pure in a sense that it already defined it in these multiple ways by cultural limits and ideologies that we inhabit. And that is epistemological dimension of impossible, but that can be also interpreted in a very ontological way, such as it is done in Carlos Castaneda's books, because Castaneda would say a very similar thing, but he would also add, well, if, for instance, a normal person concentrate on just everyday routine and shut him or herself out from all these otherworldly things, that would mean that this person stop interacting with them and create a kind of shield or a wall between themselves and the other world. That means that for this person who is deeply engaged with the everyday routine, the other world just does not exist. But the same other world with spirits and whatnot exists, for instance, for a shaman who actively seeks to interact with it, which brings both dangers and new possibilities or new opportunities. So in these several minutes, I just walked from Karl Marx to Carlos Castaneda. How that happened, well, I have no idea, but that is what my dissertation is basically about. I'll try to answer that.
I like how you ended on a really subversive note there. That's great. Yeah, we're trying to overthrow our conventional ways of thinking about science. So this is great. So maybe we can have a conversation among the panelists for a second. My first question is for Erin. I can wiggle my ears. Were you saying that that's a sign of being more evolved spiritually or less evolved spiritually? I can't remember what you're saying.
I don't think it necessarily shows anything at all, just as I do not think that the display of psychic powers necessarily says anything about human futures. I think it's equally possible that there has been sort of a constant number of folks who have psychic powers throughout history. However, there are some who believe that psychic powers can be trained and inculcated, and that folks can be taught to, for example, improve their ESP. The reason I brought up Darwin and the ears is because this idea was actually fairly common in the 19th century, that people could delve back into the animal past, and there was a lot of questions as to whether psychic powers did come from the animal past, the non-human animal past. And so it in part gave birth to this idea that we could pursue and sort of increased efficacy among humans, that if people could learn to wiggle their ears, then maybe they could also learn to pick up some other talents that perhaps might be on display in the animal kingdom. And of course, there's Rupert Sheldrake's work on pet and dog, animal ESP, etc., and so telepathy. So, I personally think that it's a good thing for people. It's a good thing for people's health to try to practice meditation and various technologies of personal transformation. But I also don't necessarily think that it makes us better, more empathetic people who are more likely to take care of others. I think that you can have quite wonderful charitable contributions that don't have anything to do with psychic power. So I am a little skeptical of the whole narrative that's grown up around, develop your personal compassion and then the world will be a better place. I'm not necessarily sure I see that happening, although I think there are many other reasons why people should be able to pursue spiritual practice and with various systems of physical discipline that are out there, from martial arts, again, to Western energy medicine, or all the different types of energy medicine that have been pursued.
So do you think that we've lost that, or we're gaining it more as we continue to evolve? Because you look at dogs and they seem to have this almost innate intuitive sense about them, like they can almost sense people's auras. But at the same time, as we continue to grow culturally and socially, we see ourselves putting atrocities of the past behind us and trying to move forward, almost as if we're evolving toward a more holistic sense of empathy. So how do you see us moving from or to, I guess, is the question.
I guess I would like to see us moving towards greater empathy, but I think that it's also a mistake to look at humanity in some way as unitary. I think even Darwin thought that civilizations and societies could rise and fall, and that there was not necessarily this unending progress. And sure, we have a lot of knowledge and technology today, and even support for developing sort of our softer spiritual side, but I don't think that it's a foregone conclusion that that's going to continue to happen. When you see what's going on geopolitically, and we've had obviously lots of talks already at this conference about how many people don't benefit at all from the transformation of the few people who are lucky enough to live in a place where they have the time and the leisure to pursue personal development. So that's my thought. That's one thought. I don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting too to think about the ways with after in the wake of Darwin, you have sort of the emergence of evolutionary social theories and other kinds of social theories, and there's a way in which we're still saddled with that inheritance of ideas about how certain things are more primitive, right? Certain kinds of people are more primitive. Certain kind of practices are more primitive, right? These are non-white people. These are women. These are people who are credulous, right? Who believe too much, who do these practices, who do spirit possession. And on the other hand, there's all of this modern stuff. And I think in many ways we're still kind of stuck with those categories in order to be like a hard rationalist, right? Or to have more of a soft sense of spirituality, right? We're still kind of stuck with those ways of thinking about what we're doing in this space that are gendered, that are racialized in certain ways. But I like the way, Erin, you're kind of mixing it up a little bit in the way that you're thinking about, there's the trajectory out of Darwin, but then there are these suppressed and repressed, evolutionary system. You mentioned Wallace, and kind of we could take that lineage to William James and other kinds of folks who, William James was kind of saddled with this too, right? I mean, we all love William James, but William James also had this idea, right, that wow, there are these like primitive people, like Methodists, or like at their tent revivals, and whoa, we go check out what they're doing, and it's like they're jumping up and down and doing these incredible things, which are all primitive, like because they're a part of like the earlier aspect of evolution. But James is also wonderful because he didn't quite believe all of that too, right? I mean, he had that other side of him that was like, although part of it might have been him just hoping to get some of that experience on his own. So anyway, I appreciate what you're doing there.
I write in my book about how there's this sort of double-ended arrow, and for some of the systems, they kind of turn it into an arc, because I think that metaphorically, people can't really figure out what to do. It's sort of like they want these animal talents, but they also want futures. And so, yeah.
Well, I love that you brought up this image that's been staring at us for months now, actually. And I love the image. I'm in awe of the design, but it really raises one thing I can't help thinking, and it really kind of goes to the heart of this difference between the world of meaning and the world of science, is that, as we all in this room know, the owl has assumed this real central significance in the sort of discourses of the paranormal. My kids, my little children love owls. They're obsessed with owls for their own reasons. I mean, half of the children's books out there are about owls, and they're like obviously kind of a totem animal in our culture, at least, and probably a lot of cultures. So they have there's so much meaning invested in this animal. But on the other hand, if you talk to scientists and people who work with birds, they'll tell you that the owls is as dumb as a post. They're the dumbest birds. They're impossible to train because they're just not that bright. They're and that the intense the reason we symbolize them is because of that intense gaze. Well, there's a reason for that. I mean, they have this incredible ocular capacity, light gathering capacity in their eyes, but it's because their eyes are shaped like tubes, and so they can't they can't turn their eyes the way other animals can, and so it gives them this fixed gaze, and we attach all this meaning to it. So there's these two opposite perspectives on the owl. I know I'm going to get probably beat up by Mike Cleland after the session, but just. I know. Well, Hey, well,
Yeah, is the
actually,
dean
there's
still here? Yeah.
there's a retrocausal theory, and I actually have to credit David Metcalf with this. But he suggested to me, and I think he may be right, that it's this image and this conference that has retro caused the whole role of the owl in the paranormal. That Whitley Strieber and Mike Clellan were precognizing, their involvement with Rice University and the archives and the impossible the whole way through. So I'll just throw that out there for.
All right, maybe we can talk for another minute, and then we can open up to the audience. But I just had one more comment about meaning. Eric, I love what you're saying about, what did you say? Science does not deal well with meaning. And I think that kind of maps to a number of our presentations, Stan and Erin, thinking about evolution and maybe the kind of lived quality of doing science and the sense that people have through their experiences that the science is it's not giving me something that I in my experience, I experience something else. Maybe it is a precognitive dream, right? Or maybe it's something psychical in psychical research in the wake of Darwin and after evolutionary theory. Or maybe it's like, Brian Greene, right? Talking to Dawkins and saying like, yeah, I know there's no afterlife, but I find myself talking to my dad who's dead. So, there's, maybe that points to an instability in science, right? That science is this thing that feels and is inhuman in some sense and has to be added to or has to be contextualized or has to be worked on by us or by people who interpret Darwin or people who interpret, I don't know, who is done interpreting, I can't remember.
Well, I don't know. I was just going to answer that though by saying like
Einstein.
maybe the problem is this, where do we get this idea that one way of knowing needs to somehow encompass, be our only epistemology? Where does that idea come from? Because that's what's implicit in Dawkins' assumptions here, that you can't have some other way of knowing or some other epistemology going on alongside science. And a lot of the, most of the scientists I know, I work with scientists, they are totally able to separate their scientific work and the tools of science from their beliefs, and they have beliefs, and they get that there are multiple ways of knowing. I think scientists get beaten up in these kinds of settings, because they're blamed for being materialists and rejecting all this stuff. But honestly, most of the scientists I know are complex people, like most people are, and they're not like Dawkins. They're like Brian Greene. They can have their religious beliefs and their paranormal beliefs, and and they realize that science is a set of tools that's good at getting at certain answers and examining certain kinds of problems, but that it's not the totality of.
So do you think they can grow together, or will they always be in parallel to one another?
I'm a parallelist on that. I've not been encouraged by attempts to sort of make them unified.
Can I jump in
like,
the same
yeah.
conversation? So probably for me the best way I can think of conceptualization of the same issue is the concept of closure by a British philosopher, Hilary Lawson, who actually proposed this model of thinking about reality as what he calls openness. That is, he just says that when we are in the reality, the world is presented to us as being kind of chaotic and undefined, and we are just presented with all sorts of experiences and whatnot, and we cannot make sense of it, but we should, because that's how we are. And so we start to create different systems of what he calls closures, different systems of limiting the world, which each is suitable for certain specific tasks. Like, for instance, there are systems of closure like scientific theories that can be used to solve certain particular practical problems. Like, for instance, to build a bridge, to create a vaccine or something. But every system of closure in this concept, it limits reality to just a certain way of explanation, of course. And there are systems of closure that are good for, building bridges, but there are others that are good for, creating art or solve other issues, like bringing societies together. And so here we have art and religion and science, all are systems of closure of this weird complexity that we call, the universe, each of which serves its own goals. So it's kind of in parallel, just what you're saying, but also they are kind of describing the same reality at the same time.
And I would also jump in and just say that I think part of the problem is that people like Dawkins, or even Thomas Henry Huxley, who was sort of the Dawkins of the 19th century, are trying to stake out territory that science actually can't study. And so, Thomas Henry Huxley wrote a famous book or essay on the physical basis of life, in which he insisted that life began with protoplasm, whereas Darwin basically thought it was perhaps not even useful to spend a lot of time thinking about the origins of life. And so in some ways you can see that these boundary lines are sort of artificial. And, Dawkins has sort of been seeing his own ideas about the selfish gene have kind of become much less relevant than they were in the 70s when he promoted them. And now people are once again, the pendulum has sort of swung back towards epigenetics and the idea that humans can have some influence on their own evolution, that it's not all about genes. So I do feel that a lot of the flashpoints seem to be something around boundary setting. And of course, Elaine Howard-Eklund, who is here at Rice, has done a lot of work interviewing scientists about their religious beliefs and ideas, and has discovered a whole range, including what she's called spiritual atheism in scientists. And many of the scientists that in the 19th century were studying these things were sort of engaged in this kinds of speculation around non-physical matter or finer types of matter that you could say are real analogs for what we try to do today with non-locality.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you. Yeah, and maybe it just speaks to ways in which 19th century positivists, all the way through to Richard Dawkins. I mean, I think they're kind of talking about a fully kind of like disciplining of the self. It's not just kind of it's not just collecting information and doing scientific work. It's a whole disciplining of the self that Dawkins is pushing people towards. But Eric's comment and Erin's comment about people compartmentalize, I think, is really actually what does happen, and Elaine Eklund's work, I think, points to that too. So I'm guessing there's plenty of people here who want to weigh in on these questions and think about science and the impossible. So
can I just
maybe we can.
Okay, can I make one more comment, though, that sort of that's on this point, and that kind of, I guess, nuances what I was saying about the parallel, the idea that we can keep these things separate. There's a way in which we can't keep them separate, and this goes to something we heard a little clip of this idea in Ed May's oral history clip the other day. But I want to. I promised him this morning that I would raise this issue again in this setting, because I think it's really important. His idea is that experimenters in science are, if they're psychic, which arguably we're all psychic, are producing unintentional expectation effects in their sciences. And another way of putting it, the way I would put it, is that if humans are really superhumans who don't know it, then the science that humans do is affected by that, and in ways that at this point, until we grasp and understand our superhumanity, science is going to be flawed intrinsically because of that non-understanding. And one of the big story a big scandal in science over the last more than a decade now is the replication crisis, and it's most famous in psychology, where 2/3 of all the findings in the top journals, were not able to be replicated. But this is happening across the sciences. It's true in the health sciences. It's affecting. It's really having a bad effect. I mean, biotech firms no longer want to invest in stuff that they read in the science journals because they know that it stands a good chance of not replicating. So it's a real problem. And, I think there's a lot of identified causes and reasons for the replication crisis. It's not just this, but I think this idea that the humans doing science are not only flawed and less than perfect objective beings, but also we are more than what we think we are. And as long as we continue to deny that superness, it's going to affect science in bad ways.
Yeah, that's cool. Thanks, Eric. Okay. Yeah. All right. So I see some hands going up. Yeah. I think there's a mic coming around.
Just a very few quick comments. First, Eric, thanks a lot for your comments. The replication crisis is not in parapsychology, actually.
Right.
The parapsychological literature is in much better shape than the psychological literature in verifying their results. I wanted to make that point.
Yeah.
Secondly, I was glad, Stan, to hear you say Karl Popper. He's one of my favorites because I spent my whole life in the laboratories, for goodness sakes, and the only reason, if I saw something weird happening, like a successful ESP experiment, I assume immediately it's wrong. Because if I can't falsify it, that statement, it's really wrong. So we spent a lot of time doing research to make sure that we're not fooling ourselves or the whole community or the world. So thank you very much, Stan, for bringing Karl Popper into this. The other issue, which is really interesting, please forgive this, I think Jeffrey might throw me out, but frankly, with all the discussions about owls, I don't give a hoot about philosophy. I'm sorry, no, I'm not. And finally,
you should retire that joke too. That's the second joke I've heard from you today that you should retire.
I'm not
I'm sorry
retire.
about it.
So the serious question is, I used to lecture on the difference between quantitative and qualitative research at the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology. And I would ask the students, okay, you all know what the hard sciences are and what the soft sciences are. And they would list physics and biology, and so is the hard science, and the social sciences, the soft ones. And I said, you got it backwards. That actually the difficult, hard sciences are the human-based sciences, for all the reasons you guys have been talking about for the last hour. And the easy sciences are the technical ones, because at least they have answers. You may have a hard time getting to those answers, but at least you have a chance at it. And a lot of times in the human things, understanding meaning and all those things is damn near impossible. Let's archive it.
That's something we were talking about last night too, how there seems to be almost infighting within anthropology, especially because we have geneticists and we have human biologists that work in an evolutionary context, and we have culture anthropology and linguistics, and there's almost a sense that the ones doing hard science, I like your redefinition of that, are somehow superior. But yeah, the ones that are looking at humans and the complexity of humans in a behavioral context are doing something far more difficult by comparison.
Yeah, it's not an accident that psychologists are the most, or scientific psychologists, I should say, are the most resistant to ESP and the paranormal, according to surveys, because that field has been riven from the start between the scientific approach and the clinical, meaning-centered approach. It's threatened to pull the field apart at various times in its history. Same with anthropology.
Okay, other questions? Yeah. There's a mic coming.
Thank you. First, I had one, just a statement for you, Chris, that I studied psych. And so I just wanted to point out when you were talking about, I think it was Richard Dawkins, who was talking to his dad. My favorite neurologist is Dr. Oliver Sacks, and he talks a lot about the differences between hallucinations and symptoms and neurological things and esoteric phenomenon. Mm-hmm. He negates esoteric phenomenon, which I think is really interesting, but he also mentions in his research on hallucinations and auditory type versus visual that people who are in a grief process, it's very common to see loved ones, to hear loved ones. So I just thought it was interesting that you mentioned that, and Oliver Sacks kind of falls in that personal paradigm of being able to look through things through a very clinical medical lens while also trying to find his own belief system along the way. So that's an interesting anecdote. But this is a question for Eric. So it's kind of personal, and you can take a hard pass on it if you want, but I was referred to your work by Dr. Gary Nolan, so of course I went and checked out your website, and this is probably a personal question, but I saw that part of your research and your topics and your trend about the white nightshirt or the T-shirt in your work. The nightshirt. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I read some of your information on your website and kind of saw where you're going with time. And it occurred to me here while I was listening to you talking about time, do you feel that the nightshirt is your version of like Einstein's compass or his watch from his uncle that he saw and he couldn't help but understanding this burning question inside of what it was? Do you think in any way that means something to you in terms of having that life-defining question about time? Because it certainly did influence his lifetime.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Okay, so I'd had this dream about these nightshirts back in the mid-'90s, and I'd written this dream down, and I'd kind of turned it into a funny article that I wrote at the time or whatever. And I'd always just kind of liked this dream for the symbolism. It was kind of amusing in a lot of ways. And anyway, when I started blogging back in the mid-aughts, I guess, 2005, whatever, 2006, I was looking for a name for my blog. I didn't even know what I was going to blog about, but I kind of vaguely wanted to write about dreams. And so I just, the nightshirt just came as a name, and so that it became, it sort of mushroomed into a blog about the paranormal and about dreams and precognition and UFOs and a bunch of other stuff like that. And then, I've reflected on that since then and thought, that dream I had back in the 90s was precognizing, it was a time loop. I was precognizing the role of the nightshirt in my life now. But it was a time loop in that because I was inspired by that dream to name my blog The Nightshirt, but I couldn't know that it was going to be a symbol essentially of dreams and the role of precognition in dreams and so on. And that dream actually turned out to be precognitive of something just a few years ago. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Good to think about.
Okay, yeah, right here.
Hi, a question from everyone, inspired by Eric, but even in, the smartest discourse about time and free will, we tend to have these polar opposites of, absolute free will or absolute determinism, which don't make any sense. I mean, we don't use those kind of binaries in the social sciences, for example. And I was stunned recently. I was interviewing Terje Simonsen, who's kind of written an encyclopedic book about the paranormal. And he said, I don't remember now if he was quoting somebody else, but he believes that precognitive experiences actually increase our free will, okay? And if I say increase our free will, I mean like on a stochastic, in a very middling kind of way. And it kind of makes sense in terms of evolution, in terms of adaptation. I mean, he says, if there are a number of future paths out there, and then you have a precognitive dream or intuition about something, it gives you kind of the option to avoid that path. But mostly I'm interested in thinking outside of this binary opposition of determinism and free will, which I hope is the general question to everybody. But Eric, you first.
Yeah, I'm not a believer in the possible, in options and I mean, or in a field of possibilities and possible futures and all that. I think that the model that I'm working on, the block universe model, that allows retrocausation, that allows precognition, that allows time travel. There's only one future, and there's only one past, and this troubles people. And I think the reason I've thought a lot about this because I get asked about free will all the time on podcasts and stuff like that, and I think it troubles people because in their imagination, they feel, if you say, well, there's no free will in the sense that you can't change the future or change the past, it feels to people like physical confinement somehow. Like they imagine that there's someplace they want to go and they can't go there. But I just try to get people to see that there's something incoherent, philosophically incoherent about the idea of changing the future from what it is. I mean, and the future is created, you're changing the present into the future by your actions. So in that sense, we have free will. I mean, the future is partly created by our actions right here in the present moment. But what do we think we want to change about the future that we can't even know? We don't like the way the future is going to turn out, and we feel like, well, I ought to be able to make it turn out differently, but it's just like making the past turn out differently. What does that mean? From a future vantage point, our future is in the past, and it's fixed. That probably is incoherent. It doesn't answer your question, but
Well, it's a tough question. Free will in a block universe. So yeah, I mean, how do you think about that? Right. I mean, if there is a block universe and everything is this block that already exists, and that time, the way we experience time is an illusion, then how do we think about free will? I mean, people have answered that question differently, Einstein and people after Einstein, including by saying things like, well, yes, everything is laid out in a block universe, but the block universe that you don't have access to, you can't see it, that block universe is a product of individual decisions people are making. So it doesn't actually take away the decisions you're making, if that makes sense. So the block universe doesn't actually negate free will in that way of thinking. And then I know someone that J.W. Dunn, and someone I've worked on too, who had precognitive dreams, wrote a book about it. He had this similar idea. He had this idea that that the block was a kind of a hazy quantum, indeterminate state. And there were possibilities in the block universe that were realized or actualized by human decisions, sort of like collapsing the wave function as you go. But I think we're down a big rabbit hole when we're trying to work on this question of like free will, and it's a real tough.
Yeah, I get more hate mail about that than anything else. Yeah. People really want to have free will, and I agree. Nothing should be framed as dichotomous. If you have black and white, it's almost always the gray area in between. But with block time, that gray area doesn't seem to exist based on our current knowledge. That can always change in the future as we develop a better understanding of physics, of quantum mechanics especially. Maybe there is some aspect of probability to it, but yeah, in the strict sense of the block universe, there's really no room for that.
There's a hand in the back up top.
Thanks. Apologies if you covered this. I came a few minutes late, so just let me know. But I'm wondering if you can speak to the role of statistics and statistical validation and concerning paranormal stuff. And I'm reminded of the work of Jessica Utz at UC. I think it was UC Davis when she worked on the Stargate program and showed the sort of statistical impossibility of the SRI program on remote viewing. And then I'm also reminded, of course, of Jim Tucker's work at UVA with some of his young patients who, this is covered in Leslie Kane's book, Surviving Death, when he's quizzing children claiming with apparent reincarnation that there's statistical significance indicating that that the phenomenon is real, I guess you can say. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know. Stan, do you want to jump in on Stan or Eric or? Statistics. Yeah, I did take statistics in college. It was my least favorite class, but do you want to jump in on the question of paranormal and statistics?
I can just say quickly that yeah, I mean, some of the findings in parapsychology are extremely well supported statistically, according to Jessica Utz's work. I mean, the meta-analyses that I've seen of precognition, specifically presentiment, unfortunately, I'm not a statistician, so I'm forced to just kind of, believe the authority of what I read. But maybe some of the.
I mean, the whole Daryl Bem controversy, right, is, and I'm not up on the latest developments, but I know he was harshly critiqued by statisticians and others, and who said that his stuff didn't make sense, and then. And I thought at one point he agreed with them, actually, and said, well, your criticisms are correct. But maybe since then he's changed his position a bit?
No, and his studies have replicated amazingly well. But no one wants to publish it. It's, but I can't really speak to the statistical dimension of it.
Yeah.
But maybe someone.
I'm a huge fanboy of statistics. I love it. I took every class I could in graduate school. Unfortunately, and definitely in parapsychology and other places, it can be very useful. With the UFO phenomenon, there's so little that's tangible that can be quantified that I think it's difficult to apply that. I was recently asked by a professor at Oxford who's wants to put together a YouGov survey of experiencers, and we've been racking our brains trying to come up with testable hypotheses, and I don't know if it's possible, to be honest, and it's heart-wrenching because I would love to, more than anything else, we have access to an international sample of people, many of whom have had experiences, but to put that in the context of a testable hypothesis has proven to be extremely difficult. So I think it absolutely applies and can be used for numerous things within the supernormal, the paranormal, whatever you want to call it, but I find that within the UFO area of research, it's much more difficult.
I know Whitley had his hand up, and then Paul.
I'd like to, well, first, it's been an absolutely fascinating panel, so thank you very much for it. I have some opinions about wiggling ears. I believe that Plato's ears, he could wiggle his ears, but I don't think Aristotle could. So that said, another comment, there was a mention of owls earlier, and there is a fellow in the audience, Mike Cleland, who has written a couple of fascinating books about owls and the close encounter experience, which are well worth exploring. But I'm not so interested in talking about that at this time. One of the things that lies behind, I think, the whole conversation is this issue of reality, which has been emerging in science in various ways recently. Chris referred to an instability in science, and Erin made brief reference to non-locality, and it got me to thinking about a paper that was published last year by Kaslav Bruckner and of the Institute of Quantum Optics in Vienna, and a group of colleagues, which is a very interesting one in that what it did was it reported on an experiment in essentially involving Schrödinger's cat, where it was possible to measure both sides of the Heisenberg cut, and on the cat side of the Heisenberg cut, if you measured there, the cat wasn't in superposition, but the lab and the scientists were. And if you crossed over, then of course the cat is once again in superposition, the familiar conundrum of Schrödinger's cat. But it means that the conundrum itself may be more fundamental than what we perceive as real. And it leads to the suggestion that reality may be generated by the observer, and in fact, that this room is full of different realities that we cannot actually detect except in ourselves, which gets me to something that I talk about a lot, which is the nature of justified true belief, which was, of course, defined by Plato back in thousands of years ago, and then challenged by Edmund Gettier in 1963 in his little short but revolutionary paper is justified true belief knowledge. So where are we with this when we find ourselves facing ambiguities, in your case, both as scientists and in the case of people like me, as people who are actually facing this experience of a fundamental ambiguity in the nature of our journey through life? Where do we stand? Is there a place to stand? Or are we going to find, is science about to discover that there is no fixed reality? I would like thoughts.
Well, I can just say something real quick. I think one place we're at is a place of new possibility. I think that's exciting to a lot of people. I think, there was a time between 1850 and between 1850 and quantum mechanics where, there was a lot of scientific positivism where folks were pretty certain that science would map and control all of reality, including human reality. And I think some of the puzzles that, Whitley, you're pointing to were a part of the undoing of that, and maybe pointing in directions of new possibilities. Like you're saying, basically quantum troubles our assumptions about what reality is, how we approach it, how we might study it. There's a lot of uncanny and odd things about quantum mechanics, and certainly, as we all know, right, there's a lot of ways in which other kinds of people in science and in non-scientific fields and in pop culture are borrowing fantastic ideas in quantum science to talk in new ways about subjectivity, objectivity, talk in new ways about impossible things. So I think it's a moment of possibility. It's also maybe an unsettling moment in science and across culture.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about, Whitley, is really interesting, and a lot of people have written about this kind of fundamental ambiguity, kind of written into the laws of nature recently. On the other hand, I mentioned this upcoming conference on retrocausation and superdeterminism, and there's an alternative to that fundamental ambiguity that is raised in these classical quantum problems like Schrodinger's cat and stuff. That over the years, over the past century, quantum physicists have avoided looking at the kind of larger meaning of the findings in their field, and there's been this kind of almost dogma. Well, just don't look at that. Just shut up and calculate was the rule. But more and more physicists are getting beyond that and really trying to understand the meaning and understanding meaning in the scientific sense of these findings and these ambiguities and so on. And the idea of retrocausation could throw even that universal ambiguity idea into upheaval, because retrocausation has kind of been the idea that has not been looked at very seriously over the decades. It's been avoided because it's hard. It's like almost it has been virtually impossible to test, but that's changing. Just in the last little over a decade, new measurement techniques have enabled these experiments that seem to show that retrocausation may explain some of these spooky quantum phenomena, and we're seeing it almost on a monthly basis in the quantum computing literature. And I believe Stanislav Bruckner, that you mentioned, is one of those researchers. These teams all over the world are showing that you can reverse the temporal sequence in a computation in a quantum computer. And if that's the case, then I really think that the revolution in physics, and I say this as a non-physicist, but I really think that the coming revolution is going to be this revolution of looking at retrocausation as the kind of the answer that really throws it's going to reframe everything. It's going to reframe all of these Schrodinger's cat problems and reframe all these mysteries of the quantum measurement problem. That's my belief. I think that we shouldn't look at this current moment where some people are writing about these fundamental ambiguities in nature as the final stage in science or whatever. I think there's going to be another answer, and it's going to lead to new kinds of certainties, but also new kinds of uncertainties. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question actually, and I've Personally, I would totally agree with this approach with the way of thinking that poses that there are multiple realities created by multiple observers, multiple people and such. But I immediately started to think in a very different direction, like probably totally different from what any of you have just discussed, so sorry in advance for that. I was thinking about how that worked in a different context, specifically in a Soviet context. Because in the Soviet context, what would a Soviet philosopher probably answer to you is that scientific objectivity and the unity of scientific explanation is greatly predefined by the state of our society in which we create the scientific theories. In other words, a properly scientific theory, a properly objective, unified scientific theory can emerge only in a properly unified society, such as socialist society, of course. Never in the United States, obviously. Yeah, the objectivity of scientific theories then would be predefined by objectivity of, or this kind of equality and unity within the society. But the interesting part of it is different, is not that. It goes even further. So I was thinking about what you, Eric, said about what you have just said before about connection between determinism and the possibility of predicting future and stuff like that. And an interesting story that I just want to share very, very quickly is a story of one person, a philosopher, who was working in an academic institution in the Soviet Union, and I knew this person personally. The point is that he was like a die-hard Marxist. But his Marxism developed so much so that he accepted this basic Marxist vision of history where society gradually transforms, and it's predetermined how it transforms. From, of course, Middle Ages and all this kind of medieval way of production to capitalism to then socialism and communism and so on. But then he thought, okay, so in Middle Ages we had religion as a basic way to describe the world. In capitalist societies, it then changed to kind of, modern science and so on. So how will our way of knowing look like in a post-capitalist society? In this, socialist utopia and so on and so forth, what will be our way of knowing? And the only answer for that question was, of course, telepathy and precognition. Because everything is so united that it's only natural that people can read minds of each other and so on and so forth. So yes, the ways we think about the topics like this can work in very strange ways. That's what I'm trying to say. And obviously, the way we think about how we think about world, whether there are multiple worlds or whether there is just one world, is very much, I think, predefined by the society we live in. That's just the major point of that.
Yeah. Thanks, Stan. Okay, I called on Paul earlier. Can we take Paul's question as the last one? Okay.
So just a quick preliminary. Jessica Utz was on my doctoral committee, so if it weren't for Ed May being here, I would probably win that 6 degrees of separation game too. But maybe, I don't know who up there asked the question, but maybe we talk a little bit afterwards about that. I may have some ideas that would go to your question. So second preliminary here, Eric, I think that trying to reconcile free will with the block universe is a really tough row to hoe, right? But until I read your book, I'm not going to go further on that. I want to find out how you reconcile that. So if you do.
I don't reckon, no.
Okay.
I'm not a free will guy.
So
I
you
think
put the
that's
rec.
baggage we should be leaving
I
behind.
see.
Yeah.
You put the rec in reconcile. Okay,
That's
I got it, yeah. So my actual comment was a little bit more easy to resolve here, right? And that is that you kind of endorse this idea of large controlled studies as a way of establishing ESP and whatever other phenomena we're talking about in the larger scientific context, and it essentially bringing it into a home that it can habitate within that. But evidence is totally insufficient for that. I mean, we already have enough evidence. Ed's little study of all of the stuff that was done in the research arm of Stargate shows a massive effect. And of course, Dean Radin documents massive effects as well. Evidence isn't enough. You have to have an explanatory framework. And not just an explanatory framework, but the one that actually brings it into the prevailing paradigm, right? You have to have, in other words, a theory. That's what the work theories do, is they create a context of understanding and explanation, but they nest within the bigger theories, and our current theory is physicalism. If you can't bring ESP, et cetera, into an explanatory context that is harmonious with physicalism, then you might as well give up on trying to get it accepted, because it's never going to be. So that's something we need to be aware of and see if there is some way we can figure that out. Maybe there will be a post-physicalism, which is what I hope for. And we talk about changing the paradigm, and I think people think it means a total revolution and throw everything out and start over fresh. That's, even Kuhn didn't recognize that as an actual paradigm shift. He was thinking in terms of a paradigm being altered to accommodate, right? And I think that's where we need to go. So,
well, I think the retrocausation revolution is going to lead to ultimately to an overarching theory that's going to be able to explain this stuff, because you have. Well, you've got quantum. You got the quantum physics on the one hand. You got quantum biology, which is poised to show how the brain is a quantum computer, and put it all together, you start to have an explanation, I think.
We can take the debate into our break, because Jeff is motioning that we need to stop.
I'm shocked by what Eric just said. No, we do need to stop. Thank you very much.